Hey, Professor Carl, this is the Global Digest think tank group. You are our guest today.
Well, I have a consultancy and I'm quite active with that. I've done 178 interactions, conferences like this since my retirement. And I've written thousands of background briefs, 2 to 4 pages, and over 3,000 media interviews since I've retired. So,
Lot, it's a lot. You're still doing time to time such consulting.
yeah, up until about 2 years ago, I had a heart attack in 2019 and triple bypass. That's restricted travel. I've recovered from that. Uh, and I've been up until last year, yeah, traveling. I turned 80 this year. So I can travel, but it seems there's discrimination against old people like me. They want the younger generation to come
I
forward.
see.
Yeah.
But you
But
still
therefore,
helping.
Zoom and all there, an awful lot of what I do is on now on internet. Well, I've lost my parade ground voice because the University of New South Wales has a contract with the Defense Department here going back to the 1960s. So when I joined the university, I taught at the Royal Military College Duntroon, which was the Army. In 1985, they merged the three services into a Defense Force Academy. So I taught there. Uh, and then I was given leave in the national interest. I've lost all sight now. I can't. Uh, I can't see you anymore. Uh, I was seconded in the national interest to the Asia-Pacific Center in Hawaii for 3 years, where I taught, where I took responsibility for the executive course curriculum and senior executive course, vice minister through Houston. Came back and directed the senior course in Australia for 3 years, and then command and staff. So I've had all levels of military education, from basic level to the top.
Australia is one of very important country in the region, and especially for security, Indo-Pacific security, and including ASEAN. Australia is very important.
In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a dual national. I'm an American by birth. I came to Australia in 1971 and later naturalized. So I have two nationalities. And I vote in both countries every 4 years in America. And voting is compulsory in Australia. But to put my American colleagues from jumping up and down, voting, the compulsory means you present yourself. You can write X on the ballot. You could turn in a blank ballot.
Right.
You haven't picked. I'd rather say that, and then we have preferential voting here. So when you ask me who I vote for, it's difficult to say because I exercise my democratic right. Not you can vote above the line by voting for a party, and then you pick all the people that party's nominated in the order that they want. But I vote below the line, so I can pick from either. In many, we are multi-party, not just two. I can pick a range of people that I think should be in government. So, to answer your question, I don't vote particularly for one party over the other. I choose the right to vote preferentially and list them from one to the end of the ballot for those people I think should be in office.
See, maybe Australia, you vote for current prime minister.
Well, you don't vote for the prime minister. You vote, as I say, preferentially, and I deliberately split my ballot between many parties. In other words, the last election we had roughly a two-party system. The government, which is Labor, but the second party is a coalition. They lost and they broke apart, and now they're getting back together again. But when I vote, I also vote in where I live, the Australian Capital Territory, and so I voted for a range of people. I didn't like. I mean, I in other words, I'm not an ideologue. I vote for Labour Party continually. I can split, and I do. I split my vote.
So because I'm asking,
It's a preferential system here, so
right,
you yeah.
right. I'm asking you because you have two country vote, so unlike other people. So I mean, in it's mean you have experience more than other people. And
Mm.
when you see conservative in America, Republican and conservative in Australia, they are same line. Similarly, Democrat in America and Labour Party in Australia, left wing.
Because of my career, I vote for what I think is the best national security candidate in both countries. So, in other words, instead of being loyal to a party, I want to vote for people that uphold the international order, the United Nations, a strong American leadership role, but rules based international order, alliances, uh, equality, mutual benefit. So it's a complex way of my looking at it when I vote. So when you vote in the American presidential election, you have to vote for the electors in a particular state for a particular candidate running for president. I don't, in Australia, you don't vote for the prime minister. You vote for the members of parliament that are standing. And I follow what they say and do in parliament. And I can vote for people in both parties that I think will support my view of national security or Australia's role in the region. Well, generally in Australia, they say that the current opposition, the Liberal Party, but it was a Liberal Party coalition, but the Liberal Party is more conservative and more pro-American than the Labor Party. So that's here you go. In America, the right of Congress to review, to have authority. So that's how I answered. Here, the Australian American alliance from 1951 to the present has usually been bipartisan. There have been times differently. During the Vietnam War, the Labor government opposed the war. They came into office, and I was visiting the United States, and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at State Department asked me, are Australians xenophobic? Do they hate Americans? And I had to explain no, but they were against the war. When America intervened in Iraq, public opinion polls show that was considered the greatest threat to American security. And in recent polls in this country, support the thinking that the United States will act responsibly have declined to the lowest level since these polls were being conducted. 36% of Australians think America is good and positive and contributing internationally. So, I'm independent in my voting, and but if you're asking about Australian views, right now we're faced. The U.S. government wants Australia to contribute to, we don't know, 3.5, 5% of GDP to defense. And the prime minister said he's not going to let that happen. We're fighting a battle. We're going to have tariffs imposed on us because where Canada just backed away, that American big tech companies can come in here and use all our journalists and other media reporting without paying for it. So to use the Trump administration, they're ripping Australia off. And this government says we will tax companies that don't negotiate with the Australian media companies to reach an agreement. So if you want to take from the Australian Broadcasting Commission or for local press or journalists, that news item, you just can't grab it and put it on your meta platforms and get away with it. You've got to pay those people for their own intellectual property.
I see. I mean, in terms of increasing GDP for defense spending, I mean, even though American is a- asking Australian to increase it, why Australia? Why not consider it is for its own Australia security purpose and as well as for the regional security purpose? Isn't good for increasing uh, defense spending in Australia, but your prime minister did not want to. Isn't
No,
paradox?
that's an excellent question because leaving Trump and everybody else aside, it's an internal debate. There was a defense strategic review, and the government is not meeting the capability that it says it's needed. In other
Right,
words, saying that since the Second World War, we're facing the worst strategic challenges, but not yet spending the money to meet it because we signed this agreement with the United States on AUKUS to acquire nuclear powered submarines in the future. And that is costing so much money that at the moment we're not defending the capabilities we need immediately. So the government has had a plan to raise defense spending from 2% to 2.3% of GDP over the next several years. But before, make a point, the Pentagon and Donald Trump have never told us where these figures come from 3.5, 5%. And it's necessary to know what capabilities does the United States want to effectively oppose China in the Indo-Pacific? What equipment, what capabilities, and how do you make it interoperability? So if every ally in the Indo-Pacific, that's Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines raise their GDP spending on defense to 5%, would that really help containing China? Because we could build swimming pools at defense installation and cause,
right,
say, that's a defense expenditure. So if we challenge the Pentagon, what is your plan? What is your leadership? What do you want countries to acquire? And can we cooperate to discuss how to get the best combined military force to oppose Chinese aggression? I mean, I'm using Hegseth's That's
right.
that, that's what he says is the challenge, and there is no answer. So, but in this country, yes, I am not happy with the Labor government's response and not spending on defense.
Right. I mean, it's true. As you said, uh, Pacific, especially Indo-Pacific region security is more serious than Atlantic Europe security, you know? I mean, European much easier compared to Indo-Pacific security because Europe has stronger finance among European countries, and also they have nuclear power country, France and Britain, and they are also Security Council member. There are many where Europe has uh, uh, they have very good position compared to Indo-Pacific because Indo-Pacific is more uh, risky compared to other European security, you know, and and also in terms of European, Russia is declining superpower, so they have not much to worry in the future. But in case of Indo-Pacific, China is a rising superpower with heavy economic power and massive military navy. It's increasing every year. That is more trade than in the region, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but I would put some caveats on that Russian aggression against Ukraine threatens Moldova and other countries, the Baltic states, for example. And Russia is also a nuclear power and has mentioned that from time to time, even in tactical operations. And it's posing the question, what do you do when a country invades and tries to overcome the sovereignty of an independent state? Do you sit back and do nothing, or do you oppose it? So Europe does have a problem. And yes, they're not spending enough on their defense, and they've realized it. And Trump's part of the way. But by the way, the US spends under 4% of its GDP on defense. So the US would have to increase. But we're missing the capability. In other words, how do you keep arming the Ukraine in a real war, which in the Indo-Pacific is not occurring? So that, and then we're also taking Europe and saying it's not connected necessarily with the security of the Middle East, but we'll leave that aside. Yes, China's military growth and its spending has been the last 3 decades increasing, increasing, increasing.
Right,
More combat ships, and Pete Hegseth, which he's just quoting what we already knew before Trump came in. The Pentagon had already, its intelligence agency is saying it. It's not secret. Xi Jinping wants the People's Liberation Army to have the capability to take Taiwan by 2027, but they see no evidence that he's planning to actually execute it. So intention and capabilities, having the capability is one thing.
right,
So the focus has to be not to have Taiwan be taken by force. There are no NATO in the region. The U.S. Australian alliance only you talk. There's no one automatically committed to go to war, and you have Trump equivocating on Article 5 of the NATO treaty. An attack on one is an attack on all. But with the Philippines and Australia, and they both had defense agreements with the U.S. in 1951, 1 month apart, it's to consult when the danger comes up. And South Korea and Japan are the same. And even though there's more and more trilateral and other cooperation with the U.S. from the Biden years and now continuing, but our defense minister, Richard Marles, has stated, and that's become an element of domestic controversy here, Australia could not help America unless there was a war in China. I mean, in other words, we couldn't stand back and do nothing. So that's a kind of hypothetical that it's now being attacked, that we've hitched
right,
ourselves to America and lost our sovereignty.
right. I mean, you point out, unlike NATO document, NATO have clear, they have agreement. If one country attack, every country should, they will be attacked back. So that is, they have agreement, but in Indo-Pacific, there was no any such agreement, as you said. And even Australia is supposed to be strong alliance with US, but you don't have bilateral such agreement directly, automatically
Yeah.
defending Australia by America or America by Australia. There is no automatic defending agreements, just bilateral agreement, as you said, just consulting level only, consulting level. It may not necessarily automatically defending, that's the thing. Same
Right.
in Philippines and
Yep.
same in Japan. It's requires strong agreement within Indo-Pacific region, like NATO documentation, automatically defending each other country, even bilateral country or trilateral country. We need such agreement, isn't it?
Well, for example, when 9/11 occurred, even though the Australia, US, New Zealand Mutual Defense Treaty, talked about aggression in the Pacific. The prime minister of the day declared that that terrorist attack on New York was an attack on the United States, which is a Pacific country. So it stretched the alliance to aid the American war on terrorism, for good or bad, internationally. So that's there. You're right. And then the Quad, which is India, Australia, Japan, and the US, is not a military alliance. So that the US has a network of hub and spokes, it used to be called, of alliance relationships. And every now and then there's under Biden, you get a trilateral meeting, a quadrilateral meeting. But that's not formalized like NATO. So if China should suddenly attack Taiwan and the US asks for support, the coordination is not the same as would be with NATO. So that's one of the things. But the interests of South Korea, Japan, and Australia would all be involved because of sea lines of communication, where we trade, and the threat to regional order in that case. So it's and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth he's twice been to the region, to Japan, where they've upgraded the alliance structure to create a higher command. So in an emergency or crisis, decisions could be made more swiftly than possible. But still, yeah, that network is still open. The Trump administration has on cards, though, to have a meeting of Japan, Korea, and Australia, and that would be part of the way. But my earlier point is that it would be nice if the U.S. could say, here's our broad plan for defense spending. Here are capabilities we would like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines to acquire. And here's how we should make it more interoperable to deal with China. And that has not occurred. And, someone was saying, if an arbitrary number, if you're a small country like the Philippines and you go up to 5% of GDP, how does that really help containing China? So, we should not fixate on the amount, but we should fixate on the capability. And then we should see, what does America want the allies to do, and what can the allies do in return? And can the U.S. hold the leadership meeting in secret where people discuss and decide defense planning over the next 5 years to create synergy and interoperability?
Right. So, and there are also some weak points in many alliances. For example, in Quad, among 4 countries, Australia, US, Japan are very strong allies. They have already bilateral agreement each other, defense agreement. But the other one country, India, is not like the 3 countries. That is a weak point in the alliance system, and especially in Quad. Or you just put India just for Quad member, but they were not committed for defense agreement, just for neutral level position. Is okay, or how's your view on that Indian position?
Well, one, I'd make a distinction between, in English, the broad use, general use of alliance and treaty alliance. And Quad is not a treaty alliance. It's a much less formal arrangement. And India has China as an opponent, obviously, because of their border and other issues. But right. India has a non-aligned foreign policy. But at the time they formed, it was to counter China with COVID aid. It was to offer financial assistance to meet the Belt and Road debt trap, so-called, that China had. But the bilateral India-U.S. relations is very deep in strategic purchase of high-end weapons and increasing cooperation, but not an alliance that would commit India to do anything outside of South Asia. So, yeah, you're right, and that's not likely to happen. Also, we theoretically the U.S. lists Thailand as a strategic as an ally, but that when the 1954, when a Manila Southeast Asia Collective Security Pact was formed, SEATO, uh, that included Thailand. Later, 1962, the two foreign ministers of Thailand and the U.S. agreed that America would come to Thailand's aid if it were subject to communist aggression, and that's a fig leaf for calling the alliance today. America can participate in their biggest military exercise, Cobra Gold, but Thailand doesn't fear it's going to be attacked from China. And I don't think Thailand would contribute anything if a war broke out over Taiwan. So you're right. So what you're really pushing, and where I would agree, is that the U.S. leadership and with regional responses is you bring together South Korea, Japan, and Australia, maybe New Zealand, but New Zealand was read out of it all because it went anti-nuclear in the 80s, and America's never forgiven them. To work with those four countries, that would be formidable. And that's why by 2030, that's a long time from now, and moving into the next decade, Australia would get between 2 and 5 Virginia class nuclear submarines with long range strike capability, greater stealth, and greater distance that could contribute to that alliance. And that's that's the argument. And Australia is putting billions of dollars into the American shipbuilding industry because America isn't producing nuclear submarines fast enough. And as we speak, there's both a Pentagon review, which could be worrisome because in the agreement is a clause that the U.S. could not sell nuclear submarines to Australia if it would detract from America's strength. And that could happen if America can't produce newer submarines as they pass these Virginia submarines to Australia. But that's, those are larger issues. And it's got to get Donald Trump and his administration not to think America first. And they go, America first, but not America only, but to think collectively. And that's, I think, a big difference. At the moment, this America first thing across the board, it resonates well with the domestic audience, but alliances are mutual arrangements. And we host American bombers, and we're building in the Western Australia a base that can take American nuclear submarines that can be permanently based there. So I'm talking about the bits and pieces, but what you're talking about, and I think we're in agreement at the strategic level, and I'll end my comments on this point, we need greater coordination, bringing together those treaty allies of the United States. The U.S. also uses the word security partners, but who else in the region has a military strong enough? There are bits and pieces in Singapore that could help, but otherwise, they're not. It's like trying to play soccer at the World Cup level and bring in a high school team. you better train the team that you currently have to go to the World Cup rather than bring on the high school team at the same time.
Right. Thailand used to betray the alliance, but it's again losing as strong as it was not like before, right? It's become losing strong alliance between Thailand and USA. Can you say like that?
Yes, well, as soon as you have a military coup, as you have, America under previous administrations just cuts Thailand off and punishes Thailand. So there's, in other words, that's underlined the rationale. And also with the time that when SEATO was formed, It included Pakistan, included India and Pakistan. No, sorry, Pakistan. And Pakistan later stopped really participating, because it was agreed that CETA only was against communist aggression. And Pakistan had joined to protect itself against Indian aggression. So the case of Thailand is the same. CETA, when it was founded, Thailand could fear communism from Vietnam or Laos, or coming through Laos. Uh, so that's left in history. And then circumstances have changed. Thailand sells and works, as most countries in Southeast Asia, with its economy with China. It does not feel physically threatened by China. And China, long ago in the 1970s, gave up supporting communist movements in Thailand, Malaysia, that threatened those governments. So the alliance, formal alliance between Thailand and the United States is out of date. It would, and I doubt the U.S. could ever get Thailand to commit to bringing it up and entering into a club to oppose China.
Let's see. So it means losing alliance, treaty alliance between Thailand and US. Also, Thailand has to think twice because it's also need it backbone security, backbone security. I mean, there are no other regional power can back Thailand in any case. I mean, we already know the capability of China, increasing every year. It's also not guarantee for Thailand security, not just Taiwan.
Well, if you were in Bangkok today, it's the spillover of conflict in Myanmar, Burma, that could affect Thailand's security.
Right.
It's criminal gang activity along the Mekong River. And that's so they work with China and Laos to try to control that. It's pirates in the Gulf of Thailand. It's not a physical threat by any insurgent movement sponsored by China against Thailand itself. And right now, Thailand has this border skirmish with Cambodia, and that we've seen it in previous years flare up into something much worse. It's not thinking, not oriented, it's military to be against China. So that it has no motivation to join. In fact, most of the time, Thailand's always advocating, let us sell more lychees and other agricultural products to China.
Thailand used to be U.S. treaty alliance. Maybe it's still now they are also treaty alliance, but it's losing something like that. And Philippines remain very strong treaty alliance. They are improving alliance, I guess, rather than 10 years ago. Philippines is improving in South Asia region in defense treaty with U.S. Maybe Philippines will be the strongest ASEAN member country defense treaty alliance with U.S. And I don't know, Singapore maybe a little bit not that strong, and Malaysia, Indonesia also most are neutral, and other countries are not any treaty, I guess. How can you make assessment, ASEAN?
Right. Well, one, under the President Marcos Jr., the Philippines have revived its defense relations with the United States. And the new Secretary of Defense in America, Pete Hegseth, visited there, and they're talking deterrence. The Philippines has a strategic location because the north of the Philippines is just below Taiwan, and there's the Bashi Channel, the Bashi Strait. And China has, in its various exercises, sails through that to encircle Taiwan. And so both northern Philippines and some of the islands, Batanes, off the Philippines, could serve to interdict or threaten Chinese naval and air movements in that area in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. At the very lower end, there are tens of thousands of Filipinos working in Taiwan, and Taiwan would need to evacuate them. And so having that capability, that's the lower end. The higher end, though, America has positioned Typhoon systems missiles that can strike mainland China, and that could be devastating. They brought in a naval air missile system which could strike ships in the region. That's caused China, pardon the language, to go ballistic in opposing it. So the Philippines has geographic position. It has a
Right.
EDCA, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So America has temporary rotational access to bases. They've been expanded, and it looks like even more American missiles will go there. The Philippines has its own defense modernization programs, getting South Korean jets, considering submarines, buying the BrahMos missile, cruise missile from India. Yeah, they're taking steps to defend their sovereignty, but every day are being confronted by the Chinese Navy, Coast Guard, and maritime militia. So they've chosen the American alliance, and they would be really a reliable support base for a contingency involving Taiwan. And China would have to think twice, because America strategy before Trump took over is to immediately disperse its assets from Guam all around the region so China couldn't strike one area and destroy everything. And the Philippines is one of those key locations. Singapore is one of the more modern but small. I mean, it has high capability, but and with Malaysia, and there you have the five-power defense arrangement. And so Singapore would possibly serve as a rear base, maintenance, and repair facility. I can't see their assets going into a high. It's like Australia as well. It's going to be a high-end warfare, and it's going to be quick necessarily. And by the time you get there, it may be all over. So,
Right.
what is it that you can and that's the strategies for China is that they attack Taiwan. They've got to do it quickly, otherwise there's the buildup can counter them. And so the role of Singapore and Australia in these is kind of secondary, because only the U.S. can mobilize and move in quickly. We can get into the scenarios later.
Right. So in ASEAN, logistic and the key position is Philippines, and also Philippines improving strong trade with America. So Philippines remain the strongest U.S. Defense treaty alliance, right? And
Absolutely.
and Thailand used to be, but Thailand is losing, and Singapore is not significant city state, city state. So it may not count as a country, probably in this geopolitical bigger image. And Indonesia, Malaysia are neutral. They are heading like the neutral position, and South Asia, Philippines, then Thailand. These two will remain, and also ASEAN member country. All of them are, even though they are not aligned with and no treaty aligned with US, but they neither treaty with China. That is the interesting is like this. They don't trust China too. Burmese people did not trust China, and they know Chinese are more economic opportunity, and they never concern for Burmese people. So that's why China is dealing with military for opportunity, advantage, benefit that China is doing. So all Burmese people know, similar to Vietnam. Vietnam is interesting. Vietnam also communist, but they are never in the same page with China. They are never in military They never together. Even they have war. They are conflict now again. South China Sea conflict again. So they never close each other. China and Vietnam, China and Myanmar, those are neighboring, land neighboring, direct, immediate neighboring country. That is South Asia position, ASEAN position. So Malaysia, Indonesia will be farther. They no reason to close with China for military issue. Only maybe they are doing trading or business. That is Southeast Asia uh, situation, and South Asia has no guaranteed security if you see overall.
Right. I would unpack it and say one, you have a five power defense arrangements Malaysia, Singapore, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand to defend Peninsula Malaysia and Singapore. It's been agreed that their defense is inseparable. And they do conduct pretty high end, robust exercises. So, in other words, they wouldn't be part of the forward American aggression or attack offensive side. But if they would have an ability to defend themselves, and then America could step in assist them. And then Singapore is interoperable and they keep planes in Texas and Australia. So you just don't attack Singapore and wipe out their Air Force. They still have planes available and they have submarines. In other words, you don't see Singapore being on the forefront of defending Taiwan, but they can check China's power, and countries like the United States could come in and back them. Indonesia does use its military naval forces to confront China a bit, but China isn't being totally aggressive in the Natuna Sea. And so that Indonesia would be in a similar capability, that they're building up their forces. They interoperate with the US as well as China. So, in other words, they're not sort of passive observers that if China should extend its aggression, the resources of these countries could be used to defend themselves and receive American support. Taiwan contingency, look, I'm out of date, from my time in Pacific Command in the 90s, but it's all about the speed. It's how quickly can China overcome the Taiwan government, and how quickly is it the U.S. could respond. And it's like if we go back to the Korean War in the 1950s, lots of countries contributed, but you needed the American forces on the ground in bulk. The rest of you are just actors on the stage helping the U.S. So, but in other words, but if Australia at that point had nuclear-powered submarines, Japan has its navy and other missiles and other assets, not necessarily South Korea. They could be used. Philippines with its missile is serving as a base for that particular contingency. But we can't use ASEAN as an umbrella term. It's as of this year, it's blueprint for political security community expired and new ones come up. It's not an alliance. It's not directed externally, and even with its meetings of various service chiefs, etc., it has no coordinated role. So the real structure for defense of Malaysia, Singapore is the FPDA, the Five Power Defense Arrangements, which would be pretty robust because it does exercise and operate. But depending on, is it a quick crisis or for a long one to operate? And Taiwan would be, and that's why Australia, to coin a Cold War expression, is a suitable piece of real estate. And what that mentioned is because of the curvature of the Earth, we receive satellite data about missile launches elsewhere and can immediately, within 90 seconds, when Iraq was attacking its neighbor, provide coordinates for counterfire. So Australia, for America, putting submarines in Western Australia and stealth bombers in the north of Australia, along with the Philippines, is part of its strategy. So that's the major, and Japan, Guam. But then the U.S. has to not put all the eggs in the Guam basket, but disperse them.
Right. So uh, ASEAN, at least that those ASEAN member has such kind of cooperation and they can have some kind of security about defense security. But especially Burma and Vietnam, these two middle
Yeah.
level country, they don't have either security. So they have to think twice about their security, you know. It is very unsecure or even, I mean, it's risky country for security in terms of defense security issue. And Laos, Cambodia is absolutely, they don't have any security, So Thailand and Vietnam and Burma have, at least they have some middle level capacity. Uh, in Laos, Cambodia is anytime China can roll out, So that is the situation. And I don't know what you suggest ASEAN is some better defense ASEAN level defense strategy within ASEAN
Well, what
cooperation or a kind of uh, networking or what system can be
right?
better
Well,
to defend in ASEAN.
although you could lump Myanmar, Burma, and Vietnam in the same basket, I would separate them in one sense that because Vietnam is perfectly stable domestically,
Right,
and if you go back about 5 years or more, Vietnam was the 10th largest importer of weapons in the world. It has built up a self reliant capability, not to attack and defeat China. 100 million Vietnamese is one middle sized Chinese province, but it's to create a deterrence, and it modernized with Russian aircraft, Russian missile ships, Gepard frigates, etc., and Kilo class submarines. Now it's uh, reached a problem because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sanctions, and it's not purchased any weapons since then because it would suffer. But Vietnam is building up its domestic industry. It's diversifying its import of weapons, but nothing very modern. But then the war in Ukraine shows us that drones are more effective, and they sink ships in the Baltic. You can sink ships in the South China Sea. So Vietnam is really, as a four no's: no military alliances, no bases, no first use of force, and no ganging, no joining one country to oppose the interest of a third. So in other words, it could defend itself. It might, it's held off a border invasion by China, and you can't do a one-on-one comparison of them two going to war. But in
right,
other words, China would have to consider. Australians had an old expression that I learned: the Auntie Jack routine, etc. Two men go into a bar and they get in a fight over a woman, and one says to the other, "You're going to beat me up, but when it's all over, you're going to lose your left arm." In other words, well, so what's your motivation to attack me? In other words, okay, it's like if Vietnam could destroy Shanghai and China could win the war, would China be happy with that outcome? So, in other words, but Vietnam maintains the deterrent. Miramar can is entirely internally focused with all of its problems, from ethnic armed groups to ethnic, whatever, people's defense,
right,
self-defense, etc. Don't want to get lost in that. ASEAN isn't. Now, it's interesting. And when ASEAN was founded in 1967, the Bangkok Declaration said all military bases should be removed, but it's up to each country to do it. So it's taken the Philippines. It hasn't done it. So ASEAN has got along where it didn't want foreign military bases when it was founded to just having to deal with a practical situation. America was expelled from the Philippines, as we know, in the 90s. But then they were given this temporary an agreement that allows them to rotate through the Philippines, but not to be there physically present. So ASEAN is never going to the level of their operations when it's maritime or search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. It's not war fighting. It's not being interoperable in that way. As I mentioned before, individual countries, Singapore, we leave the Philippines out is understood. They are well cooperating. There are hundreds of from major to minor exercises throughout every year. But Singapore and Indonesia have enough capability and have exercised with the U.S. for defensive purposes. So I'm repeating myself in that way. Now, ASEAN has an outlook on the Indo-Pacific. They want to be central, but some of that is just words in the sky. They run an East Asia summit, which brings together 10 ASEAN 8 dialogue partners, but Putin, Xi Jinping, and Biden don't show up. So the convening power of ASEAN is weakened, and I can't guess. Will Trump show up? Will Xi Jinping? Putin worries because he's been declared a criminal and doesn't want to leave the country. So in other words, the staying power of ASEAN is not as a unit isn't that great. It's just to try to stay out and diplomatic, but over the South China Sea, where the Philippines, in my opinion, is facing Chinese aggression, all they can do is come up with the same boilerplate word every year. Some countries are concerned about this, and this. And it could lead to disruption of regional security, but it doesn't prevent China from acting. And code of conduct still under negotiation.
Right.
Will it ever be legal or whatever? So we can't rule. I mean, ASEAN can provide a voice, but it's the hard end of deterrence. And the basics are it's the U.S. with Japan, Australia, basing with Taiwan, Philippines, and building up Taiwan. So the U.S. strategy under Biden, and we have to see in Obama, has been to build up the individual defense capabilities of various Southeast Asian states, not to go to war with China, but to be able to, in the beginning, initial stages, defend themselves in their interest, and then the U.S. could step in. So
right. So that's the best schedule for ASEAN to be defensive. They should prepare for defensive position, but even defensive positions, as you mentioned, ASEAN is very much vulnerable and no proper coordination. Well, when it comes to Vietnam and Burma, you point out Vietnam is much improving in terms of defensive, military, and all these weapons. I mean, it's better than Myanmar position, Burmese position, and they are more. I mean, they don't have their own internal conflict or no any problem, so they can concentrate very well in the whole country defensive position compared to Burma. Burma's case very vulnerable. Not just a conflict and a lot of ethnic. They are pro-Chinese ethnic at the Burmese Chinese border. The armed group, ethnic armed group like Kokang and Wa, Mina. Those ethnic are pro-China, pro-Chinese military, and especially drug issue, scam issue. a lot of Chinese directly involved.
There's no question. China is deeply involved, and it supports the Tatmadaw, the SAC in its operations. But then Myanmar is so complex. You have China wants stability on the border. It doesn't want to see the central government collapse. And then the array of forces opposing the government are Arakan army in Rakhine. It's completely independent doing what it's doing. And in Karen and Shan states, the same goes. There are some groups sponsored by China that China certainly has supported and then pulled back from supporting them. So it's a complex, you know what I'm saying? It's a complex mixture because China's defending its interest. It's really we're at odds with the scam industry. So it's opposing the Tatmadaw and that, the State Administrative Council, if I got it, have it right, on those particular issues. And then there are major towns near the China border under siege, and China doesn't want them to fall or wants these groups to enter a ceasefire agreement. So China's playing a complex game, but it's heavily involved. And if we look at defense spending, Burma is spending a pretty high in Southeast Asia, part of its GDP on defense. But why? Because of this internal civil war, if I can call it that. But in no way is Burma part of any coalition or capable of contributing positively to anything for ASEAN. So your original point is that could ASEAN has a treaty of amity and cooperation, which is purely defensive and protocols. So the whole world can sign on and say, right. But where ASEAN hasn't taken the next step is to say, if an external power attacks any one of our members, what should we do? That's yeah, that's where ASEAN really has to think. Now, I extend it. We look at the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. That's the only treaty where, in my mind or knowledge, ASEAN says this treaty covers the mainland areas, the territorial seas, exclusive economic zones, and continental shelves of all states. Okay, like Europe. My argument, okay, that's for the nuclear weapons zone. Why don't you make that definition and put it into the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and get ASEAN states to each pledge to help and assist each other if anyone is attacked by an external power, and get the protocol and the protocol states, like they do the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, oh, we want to uphold peace and security, to support ASEAN in defending itself. Now that would be, you could see that Laos and Cambodia, oh no, the Philippines has got a problem with China. We don't want to be called in with a war there. But in other words, hello, if you want to have ASEAN centrality, then you've got to think as a community. You've got to admit Timor-Leste, in my opinion.
Sure.
Yeah. And obviously the internal conflict in Myanmar, Burma, has got to be ended, but that's a long story. But it's nonetheless, it's got to be addressed. And ASEAN has to even take a stronger role, perhaps, on that. And like the five-power defense arrangements, it doesn't include Sabah and Sarawak, that you could expand that, add that, and add Indonesia, and eventually anybody else that wanted to join. So there's ways that in the new geopolitics of the next several decades, not to be an aggressive, but be a defensive community.
Right.
But you're like you mentioned, Cambodia looks at Thailand and Vietnam as enemies. But why not turn that into opportunities, get them to cooperate more?
Yeah. Right. I mean, about Timor-Leste, it should be admitted in ASEAN. I mean, ASEAN people welcome it, but some politician or some authoritarian or some dictator maybe obstruct for doing that, but ASEAN people were as used to be. They are part of ASEAN before independence from Indonesia, So it should be again to be part of ASEAN. And as you point out, nuclear-free zone in ASEAN is good for human being, but it doesn't mean it guarantee ASEAN security. There are
Yeah.
no exchange, no any benefit for security guarantee for ASEAN. In Burmese case, uh, already, the sovereignty, Burmese security and Burmese sovereignty is breached. That breach because military allow Chinese security in at the Jiaoqiu seaport, Jiaoqiu
Yeah.
seaport.
And
So that
Rakhine.
is a violation of Burmese constitution. No security should be enter Burma, but using military, Chinese send their security. Which means breaching Burmese security means ASEAN security.
Look, from 1948, you had the red flags and the white flags. You had Kuomintang involvement.
Right.
You had, this is a repetition in the sense you share a border. China sneezes, Burma catches cold. You have all that from history, and China is acting to protect its own interest. And there's no easy solution there. In my last year's teaching, I had at graduate level a master's course, and I'd never wanted exams. And so I had a case study, and I used Myanmar, Burma, in the future because it was not in ASEAN. So you can tell what I'm talking about. And Aung San Suu Kyi is elected, and she's in power. And then she's overthrown by a military government. And so the course members in my class were military from all over the region, including Australia. Nobody could act for their own country. Or yes, they could, but you partnered up, and everybody had to write a brief. How are my interests affected by what's going on in Burma? And so one week everybody shows up and delivers their first papers and say, okay, you're senior officials. Next step is is foreign ministers. But in the intervening period, because we had our courses at night, I want ASEAN to get together and talk and then deal with the people representing the US, Japan, China, etc. So when the final meeting happens and everybody's agreeing, my scenario was Aung San Suu Kyi escapes from prison and sets up an independent government along the Thai border. What is your solution? Now, the point of this case study was not to come up with a right or wrong answer. It was to test ASEAN's institutions and the interest of countries involved. So you get a Malaysian or an Australian officer to do the Malaysian position and think it through. So when you're asking that question, it's first of all, how do we get a ceasefire in Myanmar? It is facing now a humanitarian disaster, worse since the military coup. And that's just from US cutting aid to lack of people funding it. And the number of people affected is just horrendous. We're talking about Gaza. But if we're living in the Indo-Pacific, we have to be talking about Burma, to make that point. ASEAN's position, is 5 points, etc. Dealing with the national unity government. In other words, two of the external powers, we haven't mentioned Russia, supporting the Tatmadaw and China, have got, in other words, right now, let's leaving Taiwan aside, how could we put pressure? And that has to come from within ASEAN. You might recall in 1997 when Burma was admitted, Cambodia wasn't. It had to, because of its internal problems. But the criteria was that Myanmar was the best qualified of countries, Cambodia and Laos, because of English in its accounts. banking and finance accounts, government accounts, and it was difficult. Uh, so unfortunately, Aung San Suu Kyi has been deposed. But we need a strong leader, and that should be a priority. In other words, that hello ASEAN, how do you avoid great power intervention? You have to stop this, do everything you possibly can to get a ceasefire and settlement in Burma. Now, the problem is between using the word Myanmar and Burma. I'm told we use lexicon, it was Burma, and it's a corruption of an old word in local language for the country, and that became Burma under the Brits in Myanmar. When I worked for Pacific Command, I had to follow American, at least explain American policy, and no country can change its name unless it's approved by the citizens. So Burma. Well, I'm not a deep specialist in Burma, and it looks to me that China was also complaining that the scam centers were affecting Chinese citizens. So either China isn't controlling its own criminal elements, or they're independent actors that have kidnapped Chinese citizens, etc., to use them in the scam conditions. And Cambodia has also been implicated in this. It's no question that because the coup and the unrest that and the resistance that's followed in Burma, that it's not a governed state. The writ of the central government doesn't apply everywhere, and the control varies from place to place. So there's no question in all the reports I'm receiving that strategic analysis that China is constantly interfering to protect its own interests, protect the security of its borders, to meddle with groups that it doesn't like, to support groups that think it can advance its interest. Every now and then the situation changes, so it's got to oppose the Tatmadaw on the one hand for a while or move back and support it. All I know is without fighting a war, China has taken over Cambodia in many parts. The mafia has appeared, casinos, etc., on the border. So China has to be called into account for that, like the fentanyl smuggling into America that Trump is charging. Why is that occurring? So in other words, but this has, say it has to be raised within ASEAN, but it's got to be raised internationally. It's got to be taken to the UN. And yeah, China can veto everything. But in other words, and ASEAN has to be the bearer. And again, ceasefire, non-intervention. And in the past, we've had ASEAN countries go to the southern Philippines to oversee a China ceasefire between the Muslim insurgents and the central government there. I was a UN observer for the elections in Cambodia, and you had foreign military forces from many countries, including ASEAN, to protect the borders, to prevent things from coming through. So there's plenty of models internationally to get ASEAN to request a kind of international presence, control commissions established along the border and internal to countries if they can get a ceasefire, but also to try to report, name and shame China if it happens, cross-border interference. And the whole aim is to restore a unified government in the country that has internationally observed free and fair elections in the future.
So the point is, those Chinese people from mainland China, they came into Burmese territory and they did illegal activities. Again, that is that breach Burmese sovereignty or Burmese security. If not directly breach Burmese security, we can say it's indirectly breached Burmese security by Chinese entering inside Burma.
Right. And I guess the way I would frame it, because I'm a better specialist on Cambodia than Burma, is the Chinese state and China are two separate entities, and the Chinese state always looks after the interest of the Chinese enterprises and criminal outfits that operate abroad, because it's protecting or advancing China's interests. So, yeah, in other words, the central government, Xi Jinping, doesn't have to approve at a meeting, but they take no steps when they're learning that Chinese activities are taking place in other countries that, in China's mind, might help preserve security along their border or advance China's interest or gain it access to resources or protect the pipeline going to the, to a port. So again, it has to be raised at the international level, but the prime level is ASEAN, and not to shy
Right.
from making facts. But I said with Cambodia, the difficulty is the central government doesn't always control the businesses. It's how you get enough pressure on Beijing, the government, to stop these other activities, not turn a blind eye to them.
Right, because they are entering Burma with the communist Chinese superpower shadow, With that shadow, they enter into Burmese territory. They do illegal activities, scam. So that, at least we can say, indirectly breach Burmese sovereignty and security. And military ignored constitution. They turn blind eye. Military regime directly cooperate with Chinese government. This is government to government, military government.
Well, of course, I'm going to agree with you, because, as I was saying, China will protect its own interest, and the military regime is not able to protect the long distance between the China border and the port that we're talking about. I can't pronounce it properly, so I'll just call it the port on the bay. So it's well known, I think, in the analysis that I'm reading, yes, that China has agents, it has ways of trying to protect those particular interests, and it's just and the lines of communication to and from them, mainly because the central government is it's weak and strong at the same time. It can still fight, but it can't control and exercise governance. And so China, it's extraterritoriality. I'll just call it that. It's colonial mentality of moving into another country, claiming your own. As I say, the Chinese government always protects the interest of its independent actors.
So it is colonial, it means it's breach Burmese sovereignty, right?
Yes.
Because it's colonial will be always breach other countries' sovereignty.
Yeah, and then it's up to the State Administrative Council, to demand that China police its borders and stop this from happening, but they won't do it because they need Chinese support to keep fighting and repressing.
Of course, I mean, military itself is also illegal. That's why, in terms of Burmese people, it means Burmese people sovereignty violated. But China knows that will be breached Burmese sovereignty. Chinese government is knowingly to put Chinese security inside Burmese territory.
What China fears is a ceasefire and a settlement that would allow Western countries, maybe the United States, Europe, to get involved in reconstructing a peaceful Burma. So, yeah, China's acting in that way. It's the last thing that China wants. Now, I don't believe the Trump administration, Biden might come in for humanitarian grounds, but we leave that. But if China can exert that influence, it can influence ASEAN's decision making. It has access to the massive resources that are in Burma, and no one's pointing at them. Everybody's looking at Gaza. Everybody's looking at Iran. Everybody's looking at Taiwan, or the Philippines, but not that. It's the Western community in Europe, North America, and even Australia have let
Right,
democracy down in that country since the coup.
right,
When I lecture to my students, I'd say Burma is like a horseshoe country. The Burma people live in the center, and then there's all ethnic minorities and groups. And there are these groups that are independent of China, that are anti China, that China can't control. They exist along the border, they exist where commerce occurs. And so China has moved in and creating its own counter groups to try to influence the local situation. And it's not since 2015 with the military coup. This is longstanding Chinese involvement that so historically it's been there. The lessons would be that will last as long as it suits China's interest, because in the rest of Southeast Asia, if we go from the 50s onwards, there were Chinese supported communist movements in Thailand, in Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos. So China kept interfering there. Then it suited China to move on because these countries became stronger, independent, moved in their own direction, and China's interests were met. But all of a sudden, the overthrow of government, National League for Democracy government, created instability, and therefore China's intervened. Colonial power. The Wagner Group in Russia and Africa, protect Chinese core interest, commercial interest, access, and try to influence the evolution politically so Western powers don't return to Myanmar. So that's my historical perspective. But it's a kaleidoscope of groups that defies really making order out of it, not just pro China or anti regime, but independent and armed ethnic groups and minorities, stateless, the Rohingya people. So China's
I mean,
taking advantage of that chaos.
I mean, in this case, Nick Bogan, those Chinese speaking group, they the problem is you cannot distinguish whether they are Burmese, belong to Burmese, or they are belong to mainland China, because they speak Chinese. I mean, let the ASEAN people know why, how Burma was breached security by China. Also, international community should know it's starting breaching security and sovereignty. So we should prepare and prevent, you know.
No, I'm agreeing, and you made me think. These are ethnic Chinese that migrated into Vietnam, called the Hoa people uh, in the north, but there's business communities in the south. And the old city of Saigon had a sister city called Chalun, which meant big market. It was Chinese. When Vietnam was unified and they tried to bring socialism, uh, they ran into trouble with the Chinese businessmen. And mainland China said they were ostracized and persecuted and tried to send ships down to remove them from Vietnam. But these were residents for a long time, like you've been talking about, called the meat in the sandwich. And you remember the 1980s when you had the collapse of the New Order government in Indonesia. You had lots of Chinese businessmen flee the country because of an anti Chinese surge. So China has always historically, in a sense, extended its sovereignty wherever ethnic Chinese are speaking, no matter what Kokong or whatever other names they take on. So that's a continuity from history. And you're right. But it's a new democratic government in Myanmar must determine who is entitled to statehood, citizenship, nationality, and who constitute the Union of Burma. It's a multi-ethnic country. So there's no question, but China is pursuing its own interest, and there is no countervailing force.
Right. I mean, Gokhan cases, Burmese people accept Gokhan as they are eligible, they can become Burmese citizenship. But I mean, during this conflict or security problem, so that is very rich security, not just at the border inside Burma and military government also cooperating with Chinese security in Jiaofu. So a lot of many kind of security breach and very high risky of security indirectly or directly involvement by China. That's the thing, and they do any secret activity or like scam is secret activity, one illegal activity. One example. Then and not just that one, bigger security issue might be provoked and involved across South Asian country. That is concerned.
Well, I want to extend your argument to Australia. Since our gold rush in the 19th centuries, we've had Chinese settle in Australia and generations on. Currently, the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated the ethnic Chinese community in Australia, has used Chinese businessmen to donate to political parties, has used Chinese students and others to attack Australians who are critical of China, have even put in members of parliament's office Chinese Australians who are agents of China, who are trying to buy out critical infrastructure, the port of Darwin here. In other words, that I think if we step back and generalize that China is using those communities overseas to support the ends of the Chinese government. And our ASIO, the Australian Intelligence Security Organization, our domestic security body, has highlighted this. And from the ethnic Chinese press in Australia is seen as to be bought up and influenced, the internet, the social media. So when we hold elections here, there's an influence in constituencies where there's large numbers of Chinese. So we make the two comparisons from Myanmar here, Malaysia, Singapore, you're talking about. I think we're seeing a common pattern of Chinese using these communities to further the ends of the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And we're a strong, stable, democratic country, and we see that as a security threat.
Right.
Because it's not declared, it's hidden, it's using money, it's using people, and it's intimidating people. And I'll make a further point. We discovered China sent its policemen to this country, but they didn't wear their uniforms. They set up informal police stations in our cities to monitor their own citizens, to threaten their families back in China if they don't behave properly. So, a threat to security. Not just for Australia, but it's common around the region. Yeah.
So I heard, but I don't know exactly. As you said, I heard such kind of overseas Chinese police, something like that.
Because they can use one. They don't come in wearing their uniform, so they just look like any other Chinese visitor. But then in the Chinese community, they can threaten. They speak to you in your own language, and they tell you about your family, and they encourage you to behave in a certain way. So very clever. Or in their consulates in Adelaide, a huge complex, you find that the agents there have tea and lunch and socialize with the ethnic Chinese community and spread their influence, find those who are sympathetic, identify those who oppose to China, pressure them, offer scholarships to kids, deny others. So in other words, within ASEAN, if their ministers of security get together, they should look at it as a common issue. And when we get together in larger arrangements, we should identify that.
definitely we have to concern that also, security is a posing security threat uh, uh, more and more because many ASEAN may not realize Australia you have already experienced, but in many ASEAN maybe they did not aware. I'm now slowly I'm finding many cases. That's why I'm discussing and I see it is a threat, it is a long term, it is a very dangerous for uh, regional security and for native ASEAN community, ASEAN people. As you mentioned, China use many tactics like overseas police in different country and they have huge embassy consular office. They provide food or many other assistance and scholarship for students and many attractive.
What I was saying, the more insidious one is to get people to become very friendly. And we found not just at national level, but at state level, Chinese becoming in the office of a member of parliament and to advise, but they're really acting secretly, we now know. And even one of our senators who had to resign had accepted Chinese bribes, money, and then just spoke the Chinese line. So I think all, sex, money, status are all part of recruitment from intelligence agencies around the world. I'm not. My mind isn't coming up with cases that I know of particularly, but I am aware that, and sometimes these, for legal reasons, the published reports don't give all the details, but agents of influence, and we have to be constantly alert because in our last election, because we started off this conversation with the difference between the two parties, it was going to be a khaki election, khaki, the color of the military, on national security issues. And if Labor's raising the China threat, we now learn later that the Chinese government, through its influence, were trying to switch, telling the Chinese community not to vote for people who were anti-China.
I see.
Vote for others, and doing it in Weibo, their internet and other services. So the rest of us are ignorant. Everything's in Chinese. We don't know what's going on, but the Chinese community does, and that was direct interference.
Right.
Yeah. We can't decide who's a threat to us because if I'm ethnic Chinese, China's not a threat. Right. We saw South Korea not attend the NATO summit as a sign. If you're looking, part of your national security strategy is to play on the internal weaknesses or create weaknesses and diversions within a country. That's information warfare. China has three warfare: psychological, legal, and I forgot the other one, is all part of its fighting doctrine. And if you can undermine the morale of another country, gain the narrative dominance that this is the way you interpret history and not the other way. So we have to constantly be vigilant about that. And we know from security reports that they target academics, anybody with influence, to hack their computers and phones.
Right.
You might. Who does Carl Thayer talk to? Is anybody that he talks to of interest? So if we can hack on Carl Thayer, we can listen in when he's talking to people or exchanging emails with someone that we're interested in. And metadata, when you go to China, and I've been there several times, it's just an amazing surveillance state and gathering of enormous data of information. So now you know why artificial intelligence and quantum is important because ordinarily, I know years ago, if you go to Thailand, everything was tape recorded and everything was typed up in dossiers. Well, who can sort through now with computers? You can do keywords and come
Right.
across right, pinpoint, and so uh, and China has a massive edge in that. And I could speak from, but not with the details of my own personal experience of coming back from China with strange things on my laptop and USB.